This is Konami on the PlayStation 3. Hello everybody and welcome to another episode where I talk about Konami, the PlayStation 3, the 7th generation of consoles in general, and what I think about them today. Was this the console? Was this the generation that ultimately led to Konami getting out of the game development business? Well, statistics will tell you yes, but was the 7th generation, and specifically the PlayStation 3, the reason for their decision? It is a fascinating question, at least to me, and I'd love to provide my thoughts while going through the games that are in my collection. Whenever you talk about Konami and the PlayStation 3, you always have to start off with one of the biggest franchises, Metal Gear Solid. And for many people, Metal Gear Solid was very well represented on the PlayStation 3. Perhaps more so than any other console during that 7th generation, simply because of one of the best games that ever was released in this franchise, Metal Gear Solid 4. This was the only game that I ever really finished in the Metal Gear franchise, and definitely something that I need to sort of correct on my part. But Metal Gear Solid 4 was a very solid title. I really enjoyed it, and it was a very successful title on the PlayStation 3, at least as far as acclaims are concerned. Now they would go on to release some other games in the Metal Gear franchise, like Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, a hack and slash title that was very popular and also came out on the Xbox 360, but you also had a Metal Gear Solid collection that, in my opinion, is a better value than the recently released collection of Metal Gear 1, 2, 3, I believe. So the question is, was Metal Gear the reason why Konami ultimately quit? And perhaps some of it can be attributed to that, because the rising cost of game development, especially on a AAA franchise like Metal Gear Solid, was, I'm sure, very expensive. Kojima was known to be very meticulous about his work and take his time, and while the quality of the games definitely showed that, I'm sure Konami was feeling the internal pressure based on the rising development costs that probably led to the eventual shift in their business strategy. So Metal Gear Solid is undoubtedly one of the very important franchises in the PlayStation's life cycle, especially on the PlayStation 3, and perhaps the impact that they had on Konami. But Metal Gear was definitely not alone. We also got the likes of Silent Hill, two brand new entries in the series, Silent Hill Downpour and Silent Hill Homecoming. Two games that I played very briefly, but really never got too far into them. These games were not the most critically acclaimed games, but they are horror, and usually horror games, unless you're Resident Evil, do not do so well. Now I do realize the history behind Silent Hill, and some of the earlier games were critically acclaimed, but I personally don't think that these games are bad by any stretch of the imagination, and Silent Hill was very well represented on the PlayStation 3. We also got a Silent Hill HD collection that was very controversial for its time and probably still is to this day, because a lot of people consider the original PlayStation 2 versions of this game to be the superior version because of some editing thing that they did with this HD collection. Basically, a lot of people were not happy with the port, who developed them, and they removed some of the quote-unquote horror elements to the game by removing some fog or whatever the case it was. But yeah, Silent Hill HD Collection was a very controversial port, which is kind of surprising to see because usually a lot of these ports, they are really praised and sort of cherished on many of the consoles, but not this one. So I am sure that Konami was hoping for this series to gain as much popularity as the Resident Evil franchise, but that was probably not the case, and eventually this series kind of died off, which is very unfortunate. Luckily, we are getting a new entry, so at least there's something to look forward to in the Silent Hill franchise. I've already talked about Castlevania extensively in my many videos covering the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, but Castlevania Lords of the Shadow, Castlevania Lords of the Shadow 2, and Castlevania Lords of Shadow Collection were some of the big entries that came out for the PS3. I believe there were some digital-only games that also came out on the Xbox 360 and PS3, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Yeah, I really like these games. At least the first one, I beat it to completion. The second one, I have not even tried yet, so there's that. I have to play Lords of Shadow 2. I know it didn't do that well commercially, but I still want to try it out and see, what the game is all about. Definitely something that I'll be going back and playing someday. But yeah, Castlevania did have a decent enough representation. Probably not the more traditional Castlevania that people wanted, coming off the huge Symphony of the Night, at least on the PlayStation 1. And then a few 3D games on the PlayStation 2 that I guess this series was building off of. But Castlevania overall was not terrible on the PS3. Rounding off the big four franchises for Konami, no, not Contra, I'm talking about Pro Evolution Soccer. Arguably one of the best soccer experiences out there, at least for those generation of consoles. It is really sad to see what has become of Pro Evolution Soccer these days, but back in the day, Pro Evolution Soccer was really well regarded, and I personally really enjoyed the games a lot myself. These games were not fully licensed, but what they did have, they offered a really unique style of gameplay, very different from EA's quote-unquote more arcadey, or at least it felt different. Now I guess both of them were very sim-like, but if you played Pro Evolution Soccer, you know that the gameplay was very different and very much appreciated, and it's sad to see what has happened with this once brilliant franchise. Now let's quickly go over some of the more random titles that came out from Konami for the PlayStation 3. We have two games in the Saw franchise, Saw 1 and 2. I never really played these games, but I'm really curious to check them out. I know they're very collectible by today's standards, but definitely want to play them as I'm a big fan of survival horror, and I'm sure I'm definitely going to enjoy these games, regardless of what the reviewers say about them. Here are some other random titles, a game that is fully in Japanese. I was a big fan of importing games on the PlayStation 3 as it was region free, but unfortunately sometimes just there wasn't any translation available. This is the case. This is a 2D brawler, but I really don't know much else that is going on in the game, which is kind of unfortunate, because it seems like it would have been a really cool game to play or understand. You have Tornado Outbreak, definitely well represented on the PS3, and a unique title for people looking for something different. Never Dead also was released, sort of a mediocre game according to critics. Never really played it myself, but once again, now that people go back and look at some of these titles, they realize that, back in the day, I guess when people were getting so many of these types of games, they were kind of getting compared against one another. But when you look at them by themselves, probably from today's standards, you're going to find that these games are probably better than what the scores represent. No More Heroes is a very interesting title that came out for multiple platforms, but over here it was published by Konami, and I've never really played it. I've heard that it's not as good as some of the other versions, but hey, I guess I'll try it out someday. Zone of the Enders is one of my favorite mech games. I played it way back on the PlayStation 2, really enjoyed it, really was happy to see that the HD version was released on the PS3, and I played it for a brief amount of time and I really enjoyed my time with it. It is definitely one of those games that nobody really talks about, nobody mentions anymore, and is kind of one of those hidden Kojima games that is kind of forgotten, but Zone of the Enders is definitely worth trying out and playing. It's a really cool, unique experience, a really nice mech game, definitely worth it, and if you guys have not played it, definitely try it out. And then just rounding things off with Birds of Steel and Def Jam Rap Star, some very interesting titles from Konami. When you think of them, you don't really think about a lot of music style games, but they definitely published a lot of music rhythm style games, both on the 360 and on the PS3. This is the only one I have on the PS3, but on the 360 I have plenty more of those types of games. So overall, Konami on the PlayStation 3 was very active. They had a lot of really interesting titles, some big exclusives of course. I would say that their biggest accomplishment was in the Metal Gear franchise, at least to me, at least as far as Metacritic is concerned, but they did represent their franchises really well. Pro Evolution Soccer is still considered one of the best soccer franchises out there, and Silent Hill and Castlevania were also very well represented. It's very interesting to see how times have changed and how they basically fell off the cliff, sort of. I really am curious if it was the game sales from the PS3 that discouraged them. I know they released way more games on the Wii and also some exclusives on the Xbox 360. I don't know if those were a factor, I'm sure they were. But I think that when everything is said and done, it was really the PlayStation 3 that had the biggest games, as far as at least Metal Gear Solid is concerned. But yeah, Konami is a very fascinating story. Very interesting story. Arguably, their best years were on the PlayStation 1, some could argue the PS2, but the PlayStation 3 was not bad. And it's just a publisher that fascinates me. Anyways, those are some of my thoughts as I show you my collection. I just wanted to talk about them, highlight some of the games. Perhaps these are some games that you're looking for, some that you want to try out for yourself. I don't know. Do let me know in this comment section down below what you think of Konami. What do you think about the PlayStation 3 in general? As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you guys next time.